Hello everyone. Tonight, the Forbidden Dispensary opens a drawer we don't usually open with the lights on. This isn't a tale of distant kingdoms or heroic battlefields. There will be no crowned tyrant, no crumbling castle, no sword raised against the sun. Our story lives closer than that. It lives where your shoes come off, where the hallway creaks at night, where the air is familiar enough to trust without thinking. Home. And if you grew up after the worst of it was gone, you may carry the wrong kind of confidence into this episode. You may think what we're about to discuss belongs behind glass and antique terror, filed away in black and white photographs and dusty medical exhibits. Something your grandparents mention the way they mention ration books or coal deliveries. But for them, and for many of our parents, this wasn't a museum piece, it was a season. A summer lottery so crude and so unfair that it could rewrite a child's entire life between breakfast and bedtime. Picture it. A hot day that smells like cut grass and sidewalk heat. The neighborhood is loud with the ordinary music of childhood bicycles ticking, jump ropes slapping the pavement, a distant radio bleeding a song through an open window. Your kid runs inside, flushed, sweaty, a little cranky. Head hurts, they say, or my stomach feels weird. Or just the simplest, most harmless phrase in the world, I don't feel good. And in a safer era, that's where it ends. A nap, a cold cloth, a cartoon, a glass of water, a day or two, then back outside like nothing happened. But in the era we're walking into tonight, a parent didn't hear those words and think, common cold. They thought, is this it? Is today the day everything changes? Before we go any further, if you've been traveling with the Forbidden Dispensary through these long corridors of old fears, you already know the ritual. If you want more nights like this, support the channel in whatever way your platform makes possible, and tell me where you're listening from. I always mean it when I say it. It never stops being strange to watch a story crawl out of one room and into thousands of others, across cities and time zones, into strangers' headphones in the dark. Now, dim the lights. Let the familiar room become just a little less familiar. Because there is a shadow that has followed us for a very long time, so long that at first it didn't even have the dignity of a name. It didn't need one. It didn't announce itself like plague with bells and carts. It didn't carve down entire villages overnight. It worked differently. It was intimate. It took one child, one limb, one breath, and then it left. If you want to find the first footprints of this thing, you won't find them in a modern chart or a CDC report. You find them in stone and bone-etched evidence that survives when memories don't. We begin far from the American summers we've been describing. We begin in a place where sickness and holiness once shared a wall, where the body was not merely flesh, but an argument with the gods. Ancient Egypt. Not the Egypt of movie cliches, but the Egypt of real heat and real ceremony. Sand that turns white under noon light, temples that smell of incense and river water, linen that snaps in the breeze like paper. More than 3,000 years ago, during a dynasty that could afford to carve its victories into the world. On a limestone stele, cut with an artisan's confidence, a man is shown standing in devotion. His name preserved like a pressed flower is something like Ruma, a priest, a servant of a goddess whose titles have shifted in translation, but whose authority in that world would have been unquestioned. The carving is detailed enough that you can almost feel the pleats of his clothing. You can see the staff in his hand. You can see the posture of worship offerings extended, the body turned towards something larger than the self. But the true subject of the stele isn't his piety, it's his leg. One leg thinner, shorter. The foot angled down in a way that looks less like a stance and more like a surrender. A limb that seems to have been robbed of its argument with gravity. A withered branch beside a healthy trunk. Modern specialists have stared at that stone and, with the cold confidence of hindsight, called it what it appears to be, the aftermath of paralytic poliomyelitis. Ruma did not call it that. Ruma would not have said virus. He would not have said motor neuron. In his world, a body could be cursed or visited or punished, or simply unlucky in ways no priest could negotiate away. There is a kind of ancient cruelty in that, to be marked and to have no language for it beyond fate. And the stone is only one hint. Here and there, in the archaeological record, you find other asymmetries. A skeleton with one leg that never grew right, a joint that looks like it spent a lifetime compensating, a mummy whose posture suggests childhood paralysis carried into adulthood like a secret burden. But for most of human history, this thing did not appear as a public disaster. It appeared as isolated tragedy: a baby on a farm, a child in a coastal village, a young man in a garrison, a girl in a city alley. It would strike, steal strength like a pickpocket in a crowd, and then vanish before anyone could describe the thief. No one connected the dots, because the dots were scattered across centuries and miles. There was always illness in childhood, always fever, always death. In that constant roar, the quieter horror could hide. Even the great physicians of antiquity, the ones we teach like mythic founders Hippocrates, with his careful categories of fever and flux, left no clear description of childhood paralysis sweeping through a community. Not because it wasn't there, but because it behaved like background noise. A low endemic presence, constantly passing through populations in ways that rarely announced themselves. And here is the cruel irony, the first of many we'll meet tonight. In a world of poor sanitation, most infants were exposed very early, while their mothers' antibodies still guarded them like borrowed armor. The infection often came as nothing at all, no drama, no paralysis, perhaps a mild sickness that vanished by morning. The infant's immune system learned the shape of the enemy without paying the full price. They grew up immune. The monster was there, but it was muffled by the environment itself, by the old world's grime and constant microbial noise. It wasn't kindness, it was circumstance. Only a small fraction, about 1% of infections, took the darker path into the nervous system. And only a fraction of those left the permanent damage we can see carved in rumor's stone. It was a brutal lottery, but with so few losing tickets that humanity as a collective did not realize it was playing. For centuries, the shadow remained nameless, until the world changed. Not suddenly, not all at once, but in the way history often shifts: the slow turning of habits, the construction of pipes, the cleaning of water, the belief newly powerful that we could engineer safety. In the late 18th century, in London, a city that was both crowded and restless with new ideas, a physician began to notice something. He saw children who had been healthy, bright-eyed, ordinary, then sick for a short time, then strange in the limbs. Not dead. Marked. His name was Michael Underwood, a pediatrician in an era when childhood itself was still treated as a rough draft of adulthood, when infant death was common enough to feel in some homes like weather. Underwood wrote carefully, in the formal prose of his time, and in a small section that could have been missed. He described what he called a debility of the lower extremities. He didn't have a virus to blame. He didn't have a microscope that could show him the culprit. He had only observation: the fever first, the malaise, then the sudden flaccid weakness. Limbs that failed to keep up as the child grew. Muscles that shrank, as if the body had stopped sending them letters. Most puzzling of all, he noted something that makes the disease uniquely cruel. It often spared life. The child lived, and so the story did not end with mourning. It continued with adaptation, with braces, with the long social afterlife of disability in a world designed for the strong. The child became a reminder, a walking, limping question mark. Underwood guessed at causes the way many physicians of his day did: cold, damp, teething, the catch-all demons of pre-modern medicine. But he did something crucial. He separated this condition from the shapeless mass of childhood ailments. He gave the shadow an outline, and once you outline a shadow, you invite others to look for it. Half a century later, in Germany, another doctor and orthopedist named Jakob Heine saw enough of these children that the pattern could no longer be shrugged off as odd coincidence. He wrote a monograph. He gave it a name that, in translation, lands like a heavy label: infantile spinal paralysis. Heine did more than label it. He reasoned about where the real damage lived, not in the muscles, he suspected, but upstream in the spinal cord itself, in the grey matter where the motor neurons conduct their quiet electric business. He was right. For decades, the disease carried his name in medical circles, later joined by the Swedish physician who would recognize something else, that what looked isolated could, under certain conditions, erupt into epidemic. But even with names and theories, the enemy's true face remained hidden. At this stage, infantile spinal paralysis was still a bolt from a clear sky, a tragedy that ruined one child here, another there, without becoming the kind of communal event that changes policy and culture. That was about to end, because humanity was polishing its world, and in the clean light of progress, the shadow found its voice. When it finally screamed, it didn't sound like a mythic curse. It sounded like something far more modern. An ambulance siren in summer, a phone call after a fever, a doctor's mouth tightening before words, and in that sound, a private tragedy became a public nightmare. We'll stop here, right before the shift. The moment the old scattered lottery becomes a seasonal terror that can swallow whole cities. The scream didn't arrive all at once. At first, it was a murmur, one town's rumor, one clinic's unease, a few cases that didn't quite fit the season's usual ailments. But history has a way of taking a quiet pattern and, with the smallest change in conditions, turning it into a fire. The change wasn't the virus becoming smarter. It was us becoming cleaner. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Europe and North America began polishing their cities like proud homeowners scrubbing the steps before company arrives. Sewer lines replaced open filth. Drinking water was filtered and chlorinated. Public health departments grew teeth and paperwork. Parents were taught new habits: wash hands, boil bottles, keep the baby away from dirty things. And for so many diseases, this progress was salvation. Cholera backed off, typhoid retreated, infant mortality. The old grinding baseline sorrow finally began to loosen its grip. It should have been a pure victory. Instead, it opened a door. In the old world of constant exposure, most babies met the polio virus early, so early that the protection borrowed from their mother's immune system acted like a buffer. The first meeting was often mild, barely noticed, and it left behind something precious: immunity. But in the new clean world, the first meeting was delayed. Children grew up unintroduced. Their immune systems, never having learned the enemy's face, remained naive. And then at 5, 10, sometimes even in adolescence, they encountered the virus for the first time without that maternal shield. Now the infection had room to run. Now the odds of it slipping past the gut and blood and into the nervous system rose like a tide. It's a cruel sentence, but it's true. Polio became, in part, a disease of modernity. A disease that fed on the very conditions that made people feel safe. The first clear warning flared in Scandinavia, where public health was practically a point of national pride. In the late 1880s, Swedish physician Oskar Medin investigated a cluster of cases in Stockholm, not as disconnected tragedies, but as a single event. He mapped them, he watched the seasonality. He noticed the variety: some children with flaccid paralysis, others with fever and stiffness that looked like meningitis, others with symptoms so mild they would have been dismissed if not for what happened next door. Medin understood something the earlier physicians couldn't easily see. This thing spread. It moved through neighborhoods like an unseen weather system. It followed summer. It arrived with heat and children gathering, and water and flies and hands that touched too many shared surfaces. A warning beacon lit small, far away. Then the United States took the message and amplified it into a national trauma. America at the turn of the century was expanding, industrializing, building itself loud and fast. Cities swelled, railroads stitched towns together. People moved more, gathered more, touched more of the same public world. And polio quiet, patient found the perfect stage. The first American outbreak that forced people to look straight at the shadow happened in a place that should have been safe: rural Vermont. The Otter Valley, summer of 1894. a landscape that feels, in memory, like a postcard. Farms, hills, modest towns, not the packed tenements and immigrant streets that polite society liked to blame for contagion. And then, suddenly, children began to go limp. Not metaphorically, literally. Arms that wouldn't lift, legs that didn't obey. A fever, a headache, a day that looked like any other childhood illness. Then a body betraying itself in a way that made parents stare at their own hands as if they'd failed at the most basic job on earth. More than 100 cases in a population of only a few thousand. Children dying, survivors marked. A local physician, Charles Cavally, documented it with a carefulness that reads, even now, like a man trying to pin down smoke. He traced households and timing. He watched it jump from town to town, farm to farm. His conclusion was simple and terrifying. This wasn't a freak accident. This was contagious. The Vermont outbreak was only a prologue. As the 20th century marched forward, the epidemics grew like storms learning new routes. Every few years, somewhere, the heat would return, and with it the panic. Summer stopped being purely a season of freedom and became a season of vigilance. Parents began doing that thing humans do when they're powerless, turning the world into a minefield of maybe. Maybe the swimming pool, maybe the movie theater, maybe the birthday party, maybe the ice cream shop where kids clustered sticky-handed around the counter. Maybe the neighbor's child who had a little fever yesterday. Public health departments, lacking clear understanding of how polio moved, reached for the tools they had used against other infections. Quarantine, closures, disinfectant, signs nailed to doors like accusations. In some towns, you could smell fear before you saw it. Disinfectant in stairwells, bleach in hallways. The sharp chemical hope that scrubbing could erase what no one could see. Then came 1916, New York City, summer. If earlier outbreaks were warnings, 1916 was Revelation Polio, stepping out of the shadows and into the center of American attention with a brutality that made the nation feel suddenly primitive again. It began in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood that newspapers described with the kind of distant contempt that made it easy to believe disease belonged to them. But the virus had no loyalty to those boundaries. It crossed streets, crossed boroughs, crossed class lines like wind through an open window. Cases multiplied. A handful became dozens. Dozens became hundreds. And the city, modern, confident, electric with progress, found itself psychologically paralyzed. Panic has its own logic. It demands action even when action is blind. Newspapers printed daily tallies the way war papers print casualty lists. Parents read them over breakfast and then stared at their children as if counting limbs. Health officials launched campaigns against anything that felt like a plausible carrier. Filth, flies, bad air, immigrant neighborhoods, stray animals. Streets were sprayed with water and disinfectant in quantities that felt theatrical. There were bounties on flies' children paid to bring in jars of dead insects like little mercenaries in a microscopic war. And then one of the ugliest footnotes, pets. Cats and dogs, comforts in frightened homes, were rounded up and killed in staggering numbers because in a city that needed an explanation, it was easier to blame something you could hold by the scruff than something that lived in a child's stool and moved by hand to mouth. Families who could leave fled the city. They piled into trains and cars and carried their fear, and sometimes the virus, into the countryside. Towns outside the city tried to protect themselves with roadblocks, as if you could stop summer on the highway. Inside New York, the restrictions tightened into something that feels, reading it now, like martial law aimed at childhood. Playgrounds closed, libraries shut their doors, movie theaters went dark, children were barred from certain public spaces. Homes with cases were quarantined and marked, the way medieval cities once marked plague houses, only now with printed placards and official stamps. And in the most heartbreaking scenes, sick children were separated from parents and taken to isolation hospitals, where some would die without the face they loved most in the world within reach. By the time the air cooled enough to slow transmission, New York had thousands upon thousands of cases. Across the country, tens of thousands. The numbers mattered, but the atmosphere mattered more, a collective realization that no amount of modern confidence could guarantee safety. Polio was no longer an obscure diagnosis. It was a monster with a calendar. It arrived with heat. It hunted in summer. And no one, not yet, could say exactly how to stop it. So the battleground shifted. If cities couldn't scrub it away and quarantines couldn't reliably cage it, then the only hope lay in a quieter place. Rooms with glassware, centrifuges, and people willing to spend years chasing something too small to see. In those decades, medicine was drunk on its own victories. The age of bacteriology had turned invisible enemies into named cultured organisms on petri dishes. Scientists had learned to isolate the culprits behind tuberculosis, cholera, diphtheria, tetanus. There was a belief, not entirely arrogant, just newly confident, that every disease was a suspect waiting to be interrogated under a microscope. Polio did not cooperate. Researchers looked in water and milk. They looked in dust. They looked in tissues from victims. They found bacteria, yes, always bacteria, because the world is full of them, but none that could reliably reproduce the disease. Nothing satisfied the rigid criteria that defined causation in the new medical faith. The more they searched, the more the enemy seemed like a ghost. And in 1908, in Vienna, a city humming with science and art, and that strange pre-war intensity, two researchers performed an experiment that finally made the ghost leave fingerprints. Karl Landsteiner, already famous for work that made blood transfusions safer, teamed with a younger colleague, Erwin Popper. Their starting material was grim and intimate, a small portion of spinal cord from a child who had died in the grip of the most severe form of the disease. They did what everyone did first: stain, examine, culture. No bacteria, no neat culprit growing in obedient colonies. So they asked a question that felt, at the time, almost superstitious in its audacity. What if the agent was smaller than bacteria? What if it passed through filters designed to trap every known microbe? A few filterable agents had already been discovered in plants and animals, mysteries that could slip through porcelain filters and still cause disease. They were called viruses, but in that era the word was less a full understanding than a placeholder for the unknown. Landsteiner and Popper forced their suspension through an ultrafine filter. What came out the other side should have been sterile safe if bacteria were the cause. Then they did something controversial and, for the time, technically daring. They injected the filtrate into monkeys. And they waited. Days passed. Then sickness. Then paralysis. Legs that failed. The same terrible pattern repeated in a different species. When they examined the animal's spinal cords, the lesions told the story with a cold clarity. Grey matter damage, motor neurons destroyed, the same signature left in human victims. The conclusion landed like a door slamming. Polio was caused by a virus, a filterable agent unseen by the microscopes of the day, untouchable by the weapons built for bacteria, impossible to culture on the familiar media that had fueled so many triumphs. It was a breakthrough and a new kind of despair at the same time. Knowing you're fighting termites is one thing. You can poison termites. Knowing you're fighting a ghost changes the atmosphere of the whole house. Viruses couldn't be grown like bacteria. They needed living cells. They resisted the drugs of the era. They were invisible unless you had tools science hadn't fully built yet. But at last the enemy had a category. And once you can name something, you can begin to build strategies around it. Across the Atlantic, American laboratories, especially the Rockefeller Institute, expanded the work, passing the virus from monkey to monkey, creating a research model that made systematic study possible. The hunt became organized. The fear became, in a strange way, more rational. It had a target. Still, for the public, the disease was not a laboratory story. It was a front porch story, a schoolyard story, a summer story. And then, in 1921, polio did something that changed its public face forever. It struck a man the country would eventually treat like a symbol. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He wasn't a child in a tenement. He wasn't the anonymous victim parents whispered about. He was a 39-year-old patrician, athletic, ambitious, alive with that particular kind of confidence that comes from being told since birth that the world will likely make room for you. He was on Campobello Island, a place of clean air and pine and salt, a family refuge that felt to its owners like a reset button on the nervous system. One day of activity sailing, physical exertion, cold water, then a fatigue that didn't fit the scene. Chills, a heaviness, and then, with a speed that still reads like nightmare even to modern minds used to sudden diagnoses, weakness in the legs. Then worse, a paralysis that climbed. The medical community at first resisted the obvious. Polio didn't belong in that story. Not in that body. Not in that social class. Not in a grown man. But the virus did not care about narrative. When a specialist finally confirmed the diagnosis, it didn't just change Roosevelt's life. It would eventually change the way America funded and talked about the disease. Not because paralysis suddenly became noble, but because power had been touched by the same hand that touched the powerless. Roosevelt's pain was physical, yes, the hypersensitivity, the burning aches, the helplessness of a body that won't perform its simplest tasks. But the deeper injury was existential. His identity had been built on movement, on presence, on command. Now he was dependent, vulnerable, and in the culture of that time, dangerously unfit in the public imagination. And yet, he refused to vanish. He constructed an image the way some men construct buildings, with steel and choreography. Braces, canes, strong arms, staged entrances, press cooperation. He turned his disability into something Americans could look at without panic, by hiding most of it, and by radiating willpower in the narrow slice they were allowed to see. In private, he sought anything that could offer relief. Warm springs, Georgia water that gave him buoyancy, a sensation of movement that land denied. He bought the place and reshaped it into a refuge for others, transforming his personal battle into a community project. And in that transformation, a new phase of the war began. Because a war like this, against a disease that returns with summer, doesn't just need science, it needs money. A lot of it. And the old model of charity large donations from a few wealthy patrons couldn't meet the scale of a national dread. So Roosevelt and his allies built something new, a mass movement where ordinary people could participate, not by donating fortunes, but by donating the smallest, most democratic coin in their pocket, a dime. The phrase that would electrify America didn't come from a lab. It came from a microphone. The March of Dimes. It was brilliant because it didn't ask you to be rich. It asked you to be part of something. It turned fear into a ritual, a small coin dropped into a can as a tiny act of defiance. Chapters formed, posters appeared, films ran in theaters, volunteers went door to door. The message spread until it felt in some towns like a civic obligation. Contribute because no one is immune and because children were paying the price. The money funded care braces, wheelchairs, hospital stays, rehabilitation, and for the worst cases, the ones that turned a child's own chest into a locked door, it funded a machine that would become the cold metal icon of the era. The iron lung, a steel cylinder that looked like industrial equipment and sounded like mechanical insistence. A device that didn't cure anything but refused to let a child drown in air. Whoosh-clunk. The rhythm of borrowed breath, hospitals filled with rows of these machines like a submarine fleet docked in fluorescent light. Children's heads protruding from rubber collars, faces turned toward mirrors angled above them so they could see visitors, see nurses, see the world they were trapped beside but not fully in. Life in an iron lung was survival measured in cycles. Nurses feeding through portholes, parents speaking softly near the only exposed part of their child. The ever-present fear of power failure, of a seal slipping, of anything going wrong, because in that chamber the patient had no agency left. The iron lung was a miracle, and it was also a warning sign made of steel. And as that warning multiplied, so did the urgency in laboratories. Because at this point, it was no longer enough to manage the wreckage. It was no longer enough to immobilize limbs in plaster and hope for the best. It wasn't enough to argue about therapy in wards filled with steam and wool packs. A better brace wouldn't end the summer terror. Only prevention would. Only a vaccine could silence the calendar. And in the next part of our story, that hunt already underway will tighten into the most high-stakes scientific race of the century. With rival philosophies, unprecedented trials, national celebration, and a failure so brutal it would nearly shatter public trust, at the exact moment victory seemed certain. In the polio wards, you could tell which era of medicine you were standing in by what the children looked like. In one wing, the old doctrine ruled with stiff certainty. Immobilize. If the virus had weakened a muscle, movement was believed to be a kind of sabotage. Better to force the body into stillness, to hold limbs in correct positions until the storm inside the spinal cord passed. So they built stillness. They wrapped little legs in plaster until the casts resembled white coffins shaped to the body. They strapped children onto boards and frames, straight as sentences, day and night, their faces the only moving parts. Wards became galleries of enforced calm rows of quiet, fixed forms with eyes that tracked every footstep and every whispered conversation. It looked clinical. It also looked like surrender. Because beneath the plaster, muscles wasted in the dark, joints stiffened, circulation slowed, deformities took root. The treatment wasn't cruel in intention. Medicine was doing what it thought was safe, but the outcome often felt like a second injury layered on top of the first. And then, from a place the American medical establishment didn't consider an authority, a different kind of order arrived. Not a professor, not a polished specialist, a nurse from Australia. Elizabeth Kenny came out of the early 20th century's rural distance, where you treated what was in front of you because a hospital might be hundreds of miles away, and doctrine is a luxury when the patient is screaming. She didn't approach polio as a problem of weak muscles that must be protected from movement. She saw something else first: pain, spasm, limbs so tight the child could hardly bear a touch. Kenny's instinct was blunt and practical: relax the spasm, ease the pain. Then move what can be moved, gently, insistently, as if reminding the body of its own map. Her tools weren't sophisticated. Woolen cloth boiled in water, wrung out and applied hot to contracted limbs. Heat that sank into the muscle like persuasion. And then passive movement, slow stretches, careful range of motion exercises, what she called muscle re-education. The establishment called it quackery, not only because her theories didn't fit the accepted framework, but because she was the wrong kind of messenger. A woman, a nurse, no elite credentials, insisting that doctors were harming children with their plaster worship. For years, she fought to be heard. She gathered results the way skeptics hate anecdotes that didn't behave like controlled studies, but were too consistent to dismiss quietly. Families saw children improve. Limbs that might have frozen began to move. Deformities seemed less severe in some cases. Hope, that most volatile medicine, surged wherever her method appeared. When she brought her approach to the United States in 1940, she walked into a culture of medical authority that wasn't built to receive her kindly. She landed in Minneapolis, where polio's seasonal threat made people hungry for anything that felt like action. Hospitals gave her a ward almost the way you give a stage to an eccentric, with skepticism and a tight smile. And then her ward sounded different. It was not quiet. It was hot and humid from steam. It smelled like wet wool and liniment. Nurses didn't stand still. They worked constantly. Children cried, yes, but the sound was effort, not resignation. It was the noise of a fight. The arguments around Kenny were ferocious. Critics said any benefit came from intensive physical therapy, not her explanations. They weren't entirely wrong. Her underlying theory of mental alienation of muscles never sat comfortably with later neuroscience. But the practical shift she forced was real. Polio care began to move away from passive immobilization and toward active rehabilitation. Still, even Kenny's most devoted supporters couldn't pretend her method answered the true terror. Heat packs couldn't stop the virus from arriving. Stretching couldn't prevent a summer outbreak. At best, you could salvage function after the damage was done. What the world needed was not better cleanup after the fire. It needed someone to prevent ignition. And that meant a vaccine. In the 1940s, a quiet, methodical researcher in Pittsburgh stepped into the center of that necessity. Jonas Salk was not built like a celebrity. He spoke softly. He moved like a man who trusted data more than charisma. But inside that calm was something harder than charm, an unyielding insistence that safety must come first. By then, virology had learned a crucial trick. Viruses could be grown not on simple agar plates like bacteria, but in living tissue cultures. That meant polio could be produced in quantity. Studied, manipulated. The scientific world split into factions over how a vaccine should be made. One camp wanted a live attenuated vaccine. Take the virus, weaken it through repeated passages until it could still replicate enough to provoke strong immunity, but not enough to cause paralysis. It was elegant an imitation of natural infection. It also carried a fear that never fully goes away with live vaccines. What if it changes back? Albert Sabin, abrasive and relentless, was the spiritual leader of that approach. He believed with almost moral certainty that real immunity required a living rehearsal. Salk chose the other path. Kill the virus, show the immune system the enemy's face without letting the enemy breathe. The concept was simple. Grow the 3 known types of polio virus, then inactivate them with formaldehyde so they couldn't replicate. Preserve the outer structure, the molecular wanted poster, so the immune system would make antibodies. Many experts doubted it would work. They argued killed virus vaccines might produce immunity that was too weak or too short-lived. Salk, who had worked on inactivated influenza vaccines, believed the trade-off was worth it. A vaccine that's less perfect, but safe and deployable now, would save children this summer, not a decade from now. His lab became part factory, part monastery. To grow polio virus in the era before modern cell lines made everything cleaner, researchers relied on monkey kidney tissue cultures. It was an unsettling ecosystem of science and sacrifice. Primates imported, tissues harvested, cells cultured in bottles, virus introduced, replication monitored, fluids collected, purified, then treated carefully with formaldehyde in a balance so delicate it bordered on ritual. Too much formaldehyde, and you ruined the viral coat so the immune system wouldn't recognize it. Too little, and you didn't kill the virus at all. Salk's team iterated, tested, adjusted, tested again. Monkeys were vaccinated and later challenged with live virus. Antibodies rose, protection appeared. Then came the human leap, the moment where science stops being a whiteboard and becomes a decision about children. Salk began cautiously, vaccinating individuals who had already recovered from polio, people who likely had existing antibodies, reducing risk. The immune response was encouraging. And then, in a private act that has become legend, he vaccinated his own family, his wife and sons, and himself. Not a stunt, not a press event, a quiet declaration of confidence or, depending on your cynicism, a willingness to share risk. By early 1954, the question was no longer, can Salk make antibodies? It was, does it actually prevent paralysis in the real world? To answer that, the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, powered by the March of Dimes, by millions of small coins from ordinary families, planned something unprecedented, a field trial at a scale that would make the result impossible to ignore. The trial became, in practice, a peacetime mobilization. Dr. Thomas Francis Jr., a respected epidemiologist and Salk's former mentor, was selected to run it. His role mattered for public trust. He was not the inventor. He would be the judge. The numbers still feel unreal. More than 1 million children, multiple states, school gymnasiums turned into temporary clinics, nurses with trays of syringes, volunteers, often mothers, PTA members directing lines, calming kids, checking forms, vials coded so no one administering the injections knew whether they held vaccine or placebo. Double-blind. Placebo-controlled, a design meant to keep hope from bending data. The children were given a name that sounds sweet until you feel the weight beneath it. The polio pioneers. They arrived in lines, sleeves rolled up, faces brave in that tight-lipped way kids get when they're trying not to embarrass themselves by being afraid. The smell of rubbing alcohol, the quick sting, the little prize afterward, a sticker, a pin, a lollipop society's way of packaging enormous stakes in a child-friendly wrapper. Then the summer came. Polio came too, as it always did. Cases were tracked obsessively, diagnoses verified, samples shipped, reports filed, data accumulated in stacks and ledgers and forms paper towers of dread and hope. And for months, the country waited with the kind of tension you feel before a verdict, before a war announcement, before a diagnosis. Finally, April 12, 1955, Ann Arbor, Michigan. A hall filled with journalists, scientists, officials. Their coats damp from spring weather, their pockets full of pens and cigarettes and impatience. On stage stood Thomas Francis Jr., stern and careful, the kind of man you want reading results because he does not appear capable of exaggeration. For hours he spoke in statistics, the language of distance, incidence rates, confidence intervals, subgroup analyses. The room vibrated with barely restrained hunger for the sentence that mattered. Then it came. The vaccine was safe, potent, effective. In that instant, the room erupted. Reporters ran for phones like men escaping a fire. Flashbulbs stuttered. Outside, the message leapt city to city with the speed of relief. Church bells rang. Factory whistles screamed, not in warning, but in celebration. Parents cried in kitchens. Teachers hugged children. It felt, in the American psyche, like the end of a war that had been fought every summer on playgrounds. Salk became a national figure overnight, more than famous, almost mythic. He was invited to the White House. Manufacturers were licensed. The plan was straightforward: produce millions of doses, immunize the nation's children, slam the door on the summer terror. The victory looked clean. History rarely is. 13 days after that triumphant announcement, cracks appeared in the most terrifying way possible. Not as rumors, not as politics, but as paralyzed children. A doctor in California reported a case of polio in a child who had recently been vaccinated. Then another, then more. At first, officials tried to interpret the reports in the most comforting way. Coincidence? Incubation before vaccination? Background cases that would have happened anyway. But the pattern tightened. The cases clustered. The same manufacturer's name kept surfacing like a stain you can't wash out. Cutter Laboratories, a family-run company in Berkeley producing Salk's inactivated vaccine. Something had gone wrong in the very step designed to make the vaccine safe: inactivation. Formaldehyde had failed to kill all the virus. In certain batches, live polio virus remained protected inside tiny clumps of tissue that the chemical didn't fully penetrate. The result is almost too horrible to say plainly. In those doses, what children received was not protection, it was infection. Tens of thousands were exposed, hundreds developed polio. Some were paralyzed, some died. The Cutter incident detonated public confidence like a bomb placed beneath a celebration. The Surgeon General halted the vaccination program. The country that had just rung bells now held its breath again, but for a different reason: fear that the cure itself could be a weapon. Investigations followed, regulations tightened, batch testing became rigorous. Government oversight of biologics transformed. The disaster wrote new rules in blood and paralysis. And in the background, watching the entire arc triumph, catastrophe, mistrust. Another scientist saw what he believed was evidence for his own argument. Albert Sabin. To Sabin, Salk's injected killed virus vaccine was a partial solution. It protected individuals from paralysis, yes, but did not reliably stop the virus from replicating in the gut and spreading silently. It was a shield, not a firewall. Sabin wanted eradication. And for that, he believed you needed a vaccine that acted where the virus entered, the intestine. You needed mucosal immunity, not just antibodies circulating in blood. You needed a live attenuated virus. But after Qatar, the American public could barely tolerate vaccines at all, let alone the idea of feeding children a living virus on purpose. Sabin found himself blocked not by his data, but by politics and psychology. So his story took a turn that only makes sense in the 20th century. He went looking for a proving ground elsewhere. And in the strangest collaboration of the Cold War, he found it behind the Iron Curtain. Sabin was, in temperament, the opposite of a man built for public celebration. Where Salk could stand at a podium and let the nation project its gratitude onto his face, Sabin seemed to dare people to misunderstand him. He was blunt, he was impatient. He carried his convictions like a hammer. In interviews, he could sound less like a savior in waiting and more like a prosecutor arguing that the world had chosen the wrong defendant. And the world, at least in America, had chosen. Salk's vaccine had been hailed as victory, then bruised by Qatar, then salvaged by regulation and careful manufacturing. The United States was recommitting to injection campaigns. Health departments were building infrastructure around needles, clinics, refrigeration, trained staff, compliance. Sabin stood to the side insisting, "You're building a wall where you need to drain the swamp." Because polio, he argued, wasn't only a disease of paralysis. It was, more often, a disease of silence. Most infections never produced paralysis at all. They produced a mild illness, or none. Yet those invisible cases still replicated virus in the gut and shed it into the environment. Children who never limped could still pass the torch to the child who would. Salk's vaccine given by injection into muscle was excellent at producing antibodies in the blood. It protected the vaccinated child from the worst outcome, the virus reaching the nervous system. But it did not always prevent infection in the intestines. It did not always stop shedding. In a community, that meant transmission could continue in the background like a low electrical hum. Sabin's dream was not merely protection, it was interruption. A vaccine that could block the virus at the gate, create immunity in the gut itself, so the vaccinated person wouldn't become a silent carrier. If enough people received it, the virus would find nowhere to go. It would hit immune bodies like waves against rock until it simply stopped. The science required something that made policymakers flinch. A live virus. Not wild, not virulent. A domesticated version attenuated by repeated passages through non-human environments until it adapted away from human nerve tissue. The trick was to weaken it enough that it wouldn't paralyze, but keep it strong enough to replicate briefly and teach the immune system a lasting lesson. It was an art as much as a method, selective survival, microscopic evolution guided by human intention. Strains tested, discarded, refined. An endless process of almost and not safe enough and doesn't immunize well, and back to the bench. Sabin's problem was that science alone does not approve vaccines. Societies approve vaccines. And in 1950s, America still traumatized by summer epidemics, still haunted by the Qatar incident. The phrase "live polio virus" sounded like madness. The National Foundation that had bankrolled Salk had little appetite for a second revolution that might look politically like admitting the first was incomplete. Sabin needed a trial on a scale that could not be dismissed as a laboratory fantasy. He needed millions, and the United States at that moment would not give them to him. So he turned outward. He looked for a system capable of mass mobilization, for officials willing to gamble in exchange for the promise of a dramatic public health victory. And he found willing partners in the most ideologically inconvenient place possible, the Soviet Union. The collaboration began not with speeches about détente, but with scientists recognizing one another's seriousness. In Moscow, Sabin met Mikhail Chumakov, head of the USSR's polio research efforts, a virologist with both ambition and the kind of bureaucratic leverage that comes with centralized authority. Chumakov and his colleagues had their own experience with polio outbreaks. They had their own urgency. They also understood propaganda. If the Soviet system could crush a disease that terrified Americans, it would be a triumph broadcast far beyond medicine. But in those first exchanges, what mattered was trust in the most personal form. Chumakov's team tested Sabin's strains in ways that would make modern ethics committees choke on paperwork. They vaccinated their own circle's children, relatives, an act not of recklessness, but of demonstration. We believe this enough to put it in our family. Then the trials expanded, 1957 into 1959, across the Soviet Union and its allied countries. Millions upon millions of children took Sabin's vaccine. Not injected, swallowed, viral droplets delivered orally, replicating briefly in the gut, training immune defenses where the virus liked to live. The results were not subtle. Polio rates fell hard. Epidemics that once arrived with summer began to break apart, like storms losing moisture. Regions that had expected yearly dread began to see empty wards. In some places, the disease vanished so quickly, it felt like someone had turned off a radio that had been blaring for decades. And then, from behind the Iron Curtain, this inconvenient truth drifted back to the West. The live oral vaccine worked. It was safe at scale. It was potent. It could stop transmission. It was the kind of evidence that changes policy not through argument, but through embarrassment. America, wealthy, medically advanced, proud, watched its rival demonstrate a tool developed by an American scientist that America itself had refused to embrace. Pressure mounted, trials expanded, regulatory pathways opened. By the early 1960s, Sabin's oral polio vaccine was licensed in the United States. And this is where the story turns from laboratory drama to logistical poetry. Because the oral vaccine had an advantage so obvious, it feels almost unfair. No needles, no syringes, no alcohol swabs, no trained injector required for every dose. No child bracing themselves for that sharp, clean pain. All you needed was the vaccine, a way to measure it, and a mouth. This transformed vaccination from a clinical procedure into something closer to a community ritual. Teachers could help. Volunteers could help. Church basements could host it. Town halls, school cafeterias, any place with tables and lines could become a battlefield where the weapons were tiny and the victories invisible. There was only one small problem. The vaccine tasted bad. Bitter enough that some children would spit it out, cry, refuse, clamp their lips like locked doors. And if your entire strategy depends on mass participation, you can't afford a delivery method that triggers rebellion in every toddler. So public health workers did what humans always do when they need cooperation from children. They bribed them, not with cash, with sugar. The sugar cube became one of the strangest icons of 20th century medicine, a sweet, innocent little block transformed into a carrier for a living virus. A volunteer would lift a cube with tongs, drip the pink liquid onto it. 2 drops, measured then, place it into a child's mouth like a tiny sacrament. The child chewed, smiled, swallowed. No fear, no pain, just a treat that happened to carry immunity. This was more than convenience. It was psychological engineering in the gentlest form. It turned the act of vaccination into something almost festive. It disarmed resistance with sweetness and simplicity. In America, Sabin Sundays appeared mass vaccination days, where communities lined up not for injections, but for sugar cubes. Parents brought children, churches opened doors, health departments coordinated supplies. In a short span, tens of millions took the oral vaccine. And on the global stage, the oral vaccine became the chosen weapon for an even more ambitious dream. Eradication. The World Health Organization and its partners needed a tool that could be deployed in places without dense medical infrastructure. Needles demand clinics. Needles demand trained staff. Needles demand careful, sterile technique. Oral drops demand far less. In remote villages, in crowded neighborhoods, in places where electricity was unreliable and travel was measured in hours on foot, an oral vaccine offered a possibility that felt almost miraculous. A table, a chair, a vial, a line of children, a sweet cube. and a future less haunted. Polio cases collapsed across country after country. Wards that had once echoed with the whoosh-clunk rhythm of iron lungs began to empty. The machines didn't disappear overnight, but they shifted in cultural meaning, from common equipment to relics of a fading terror. Public pools reopened. Summer regained its innocence in places that had forgotten what that felt like. Yet even as the oral vaccine won the war in most of the world, it carried a small shadow inside it, a risk so rare that for decades it was considered acceptable, but so real that it would later complicate the final phase of victory. Because Sabin's vaccine used a living virus, weakened but alive. In extremely rare cases, that weakened virus could mutate as it spread from person to person, especially in under-vaccinated communities, and regain the ability to cause paralysis. Not often vanishingly often compared to wild polio, but enough to create a new kind of outbreak in a world that was almost free of the original enemy. A paradox. The tool that brought eradication within reach could, if mishandled by gaps in coverage, become part of the remaining problem. For the mid-century world drowning in wild polio, it was a price many were willing to pay. The risk was microscopic compared to the certainty of summer paralysis without vaccination. But time changes the math. When wild polio becomes rare, any vaccine-caused case becomes louder, and the endgame would become not just a fight against the virus in nature, but a fight against our own solution's unintended echoes. Still, for a while, glorious hard-earned decades, the story felt finished. In most places, it was. People who had lived through the era of quarantines and placarded doors watched their children grow up without the same dread. Survivors built lives around braces and weakened limbs. Yes, but with the quiet satisfaction of believing the monster had been chained for good. Then, as so often happens with old enemies, the past returned not as reinfection, but as consequence. A rumor started among survivors. Not a rumor about contagion, a rumor about their own bodies. In the 1970s and 80s, men and women who had survived childhood polio began reporting something unsettling. After decades of stability, strength was slipping away. A cane that had been enough became two. A staircase that had been manageable turned into a daily negotiation. Muscles that had served faithfully for 30 years began to burn with fatigue, as if they were being asked to do more than the body could afford. This wasn't ordinary aging. It felt like betrayal. Doctors at first did what institutions often do with experiences that don't fit their categories. They minimized. They suggested depression, arthritis, anxiety. You're just getting older. But survivors knew the difference between normal tiredness and the kind of exhaustion that feels like someone has drained the wiring from your walls. They had lived their entire lives measuring effort. They could tell when something had changed. Eventually, the medical community gave the phenomenon a name: post-polio syndrome. And the explanation, when it arrived, was almost cruel in its logic. Polio's damage is primarily to motor neurons in the spinal cord. When those neurons die, the muscle fibers they control lose their signal and become paralyzed. But the body's stubborn, resourceful tries to compensate. Surviving motor neurons sprout new branches, extending themselves to adopt orphaned muscle fibers. One neuron that once controlled a small unit might end up controlling a massive one. It's a heroic adaptation, a kind of biological overtime. It's how some survivors regained function, how they walked again, how they lived with a strength that looked like a miracle. But overtime is not free. Decades later, those enlarged motor units begin to fail under the metabolic burden. The sprouts retract, connections drop out, weakness returns. Not because the virus has come back, but because the nervous system's improvised scaffolding is finally collapsing from exhaustion. It is, in a terrible sense, the long bill for survival. Post-polio syndrome didn't usually kill, but it stole independence with quiet efficiency. It forced some survivors back into wheelchairs after years of walking. It narrowed lives that had been hard-won. And it served as a reminder that polio's legacy was never only the summer it struck. It was the lifetime it altered. This deeper understanding added urgency to a global goal that had already begun to form. Not simply controlling polio, but erasing it entirely so no one else would ever carry its scars into old age. Which brings us to the most ambitious promise public health has ever made about this disease: the promise to silence it everywhere, forever. In the next part, the Forbidden Dispensary follows that promise into the modern world. The global eradication campaign, the last mile, and the strange reality that when a disease is nearly gone, the final battles are often the most dangerous, not medically, but politically, socially, and psychologically. The last phase of a war is rarely cinematic. It doesn't look like victory parades. It looks like paperwork, generators, maps with pins, and people sweating through their shirts in rooms where the air conditioner has failed again. It looks like arguments over budgets and fuel. It looks like a nurse on a motorcycle with a cooler strapped behind her like a precious organ. Polio's endgame began not with a scream, but with a promise. In 1988, the World Health Assembly, 41 years after the world had started to believe vaccines could truly rewrite fate, set an audacious goal: eradicate poliomyelitis globally. Not control it, not reduce it, erase it. At the time, that promise was almost offensively bold. Polio was still endemic in over 100 countries. Hundreds of thousands of children were paralyzed each year. And unlike smallpox, which had been eradicated just years earlier, polio was a stealth artist. For every paralyzed child, there could be hundreds of infections that left no obvious mark. The virus could move quietly through a community, hitchhiking from hand to mouth, from water to food, spreading invisibly while officials chased only the rare cases that shouted. Eradication would mean hunting a shadow in a crowded room. To even attempt it required an alliance larger than any single government's pride. So they built one. The Global Polio Eradication Initiative became a coalition with an almost unreal scope. The World Health Organization, UNICEF, the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and crucially, Rotary International. Rotary's role was not decorative. It was muscle. It was volunteers with clipboards and local contacts. It was a global civic network that could raise money, mobilize communities, and apply pressure where bureaucracies stalled. Over time, other players joined with massive resources, philanthropic foundations, national governments, regional partners, but the initiative's essential nature remained the same: a public-private machine designed to do something humanity had almost never done. The strategy on paper was disarmingly simple. In reality, it was a logistical symphony that required near-constant improvisation. First, routine immunization. Make sure every infant receives protection as part of normal healthcare. Second, national immunization days, mass campaigns where the goal isn't most children, but every child repeatedly in tight intervals, so the virus has no susceptible bodies to keep its chain alive. Third, surveillance. Watch for every case of acute flaccid paralysis, any child suddenly losing the ability to move a limb, and test to determine whether polio is responsible. Fourth, mopping up. When the virus is found, flood that area with vaccination like firefighters surrounding a spark. This was the theory. Now imagine the practice. Hundreds of millions of doses of oral vaccine had to be produced, stored, shipped, kept cold, distributed down to the last village road and alley. The cold chain wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal chain of refrigeration that had to survive deserts, monsoon seasons, power outages, political borders, and war zones. Vaccines traveled in coolers and on donkeys, in canoes, in trucks with broken suspensions, in helicopters, in the pockets of health workers walking for hours in heat that turned plastic soft. The route from manufacturer to child sometimes looked like a relay race designed by geography itself. And then there were the people. Millions of vaccinators, often local women, because trust matters, and mothers will open doors to someone who feels like community went door to door. They carried vaccine vials, tally sheets, and indelible ink. That ink became an emblem of the campaign, a purple mark placed on a child's finger to show they'd been vaccinated. It was proof, yes, but also a signal to the next team. Don't waste doses here. Move on. The chain is holding. Country by country, the map changed. The Americas were certified polio-free in 1994. The Western Pacific region vast, including China, followed in 2000. Europe in 2002, when India, once the global epicenter, was certified polio-free as part of the Southeast Asia region in 2014, it felt like a miracle earned through brute persistence. A place that had seemed impossible, too crowded, too complex, too constantly in motion, had been brought to zero through repeated campaigns, surveillance, and relentless community work. And the numbers told the story in the only language that matters at that scale. Cases fell by more than 99%. 2 of the 3 wild poliovirus types were declared eradicated type 2, then type 3. Only type 1 remained in the wild. The enemy was cornered. And then, as every exterminator will tell you, the corner is where the fight becomes ugly. Because the last surviving pockets of polio were not just remote. They were complicated. By the late 2010s into the 2020s, wild poliovirus type 1 persisted primarily in Afghanistan and Pakistan, in regions where geography and politics intertwine like barbed wire. Mountainous terrain, mobile populations, border areas where authority changes hands in ways outsiders don't always understand. Communities that have been promised help and delivered harm, often enough that skepticism becomes a survival instinct. And into that skepticism, the virus crawled. Eradication at this stage was no longer mostly a medical challenge. It was a human one. A vaccine can be scientifically perfect and still fail if people refuse it. Mistrust became the terrain polio used as shelter. Rumors, some spontaneous, some planted, spread that vaccination was a Western plot to sterilize children, or to mark them, or to poison them, or to spy. In areas where identity and faith are weaponized, health efforts were sometimes painted as invasion by other means. And then the nightmare escalated. Vaccinators, people carrying drops meant to protect children, were attacked. Some were shot. Some were ambushed with their escorts. Men and women doing one of the most moral jobs imaginable were treated like enemy agents. In the Forbidden Dispensary, we talk a lot about pathogens, but this is where you see what truly keeps a disease alive. Not only biology, but the fractures in society that biology can exploit. And as if politics weren't enough, the final mile contained a biological irony sharp enough to draw blood. The oral polio vaccine, Sabin's brilliant, simple tool, uses live attenuated virus. In a well-vaccinated community, that's a feature. The vaccine virus can spread briefly and boost immunity indirectly. But in an under-vaccinated community, the vaccine virus can circulate longer than intended. And the longer it circulates, the more chances it has to mutate. Rarely, but not never, the attenuated virus can revert toward a form capable of causing paralysis. When that happens, and it spreads in a community with low coverage, you can get outbreaks of what's called circulating vaccine-derived poliovirus, CVDPV. For the child who becomes paralyzed, the distinction between wild polio and vaccine-derived polio is academic. The outcome is the same, a limb that will never feel the same weight again. This is the paradox of the endgame. The world got so close to zero that the vaccine, once a hero, became in some places the main source of remaining cases, not because the vaccine is bad, but because gaps in coverage turn any live virus strategy into a risk. So the eradication strategy began shifting. The inactivated polio vaccine, IPV Salk's killed virus approach, cannot cause polio. It contains no live agent. But it is more expensive. It requires injection. It requires supply chains that can support syringes, safety, trained staff, and careful disposal. It's harder to deploy at scale in the hardest places. The world found itself in a strange modern dilemma. The simplest weapon has a rare flaw. The safest weapon is harder to deliver everywhere it's needed. And still the campaign pushed forward, adapting, tightening, learning. Surveillance grew sharper. Genetic sequencing allowed scientists to trace viral lineages like detectives tracing fingerprints, identifying whether a case came from wild virus or vaccine-derived strains, and mapping spread not just by geography, but by evolution. Negotiations, sometimes formal, sometimes improvised, created days of tranquility, temporary ceasefires, so vaccinators could cross front lines and reach children caught in conflict. Religious leaders issued statements supporting vaccination. Community elders were recruited as advocates. In some places, polio teams expanded their mission. They delivered other health services alongside vaccine drops, basic care, nutrition, sanitation support, because trust grows when people see benefit, not just instruction. Eradication became not only a medical campaign, but a social project, rebuilding belief in public health where belief had been burned away. And then, quietly, another truth emerged from decades of labor. The polio infrastructure, the labs, the cold chain networks, the emergency operation centers, the trained field teams did not exist only for polio. It became a skeleton for broader health security. In Nigeria, polio surveillance networks helped detect and respond to Ebola threats. In multiple countries, the same door-to-door machinery used for polio was used to distribute vitamin A, to support measles vaccination, to strengthen routine immunization. Later, during COVID-19, polio-funded systems were repurposed for tracking, logistics, and vaccine delivery in places that might otherwise have been blind. Polio eradication wasn't just about removing one disease. It was about building a global nervous system capable of sensing and responding to threats. Still, none of this makes the final days less tense. Because eradication is a peculiar kind of victory. You can't declare it when cases are low. You can only declare it after the virus has been absent long enough, under surveillance strong enough, that you are confident it's truly gone. That means the world holds its breath in extended increments. It waits through seasons. It waits through reports. It waits through the silence and asks whether the silence is real or whether the virus is simply hiding in an untested pocket. And the last pockets, as we've learned, are rarely purely medical. They are places where the virus can hide inside human systems, inside mistrust, inside conflict, inside poverty, inside the fatigue of endless campaigns. This is why the end of polio has taken longer than the dreamers of 1988 expected. They underestimated not science, but the world. They underestimated how difficult it is to reach every child, every time, when roads wash out, when rumors spread faster than trucks, when a vaccinator must weigh a route against her safety. And yet the story's core remains unchanged from that first limestone stele and that first London description. A small thing can ruin a life, and therefore a small act too, drops, a dime, a door opened, a finger marked purple can help save one. In the next and final part, we'll step back from the field and look at the full arc. What polio taught the world about fear, trust, science, and perseverance, and why the real legacy of the polio era isn't just the absence of a virus, but the systems and ethics we built while trying to make the summers safe again. When you've lived long enough under a seasonal fear, you don't realize how much of your mind it occupies until the fear is gone. It's the same with a sound you grew up hearing, a train at night, a factory whistle, the neighbor's dog. You stop noticing it. It becomes part of the architecture of your thoughts. Then one day it stops, and the silence feels unnatural, almost suspicious. Polio did that to whole generations. It wasn't just the paralysis. It wasn't just the photographs of children in braces or the steel cylinders lined up like industrial tombs. It was the way the disease changed the weather of family life. It taught parents to interpret a headache like an omen. It taught communities to see swimming pools as possible crime scenes. It taught children, very early, that their bodies could be betrayed by something they could not see. And then, through vaccination, through public mobilization, through slow global persistence, the sound began to fade. In many places, it faded so thoroughly that a new generation grew up believing the terror had always been a story, something adults exaggerated, the way adults always seem to exaggerate. That amnesia is natural. It's also dangerous. Because the real legacy of polio isn't only the virus and its disappearance, it's what we built while trying to stop it and what we learned about ourselves in the process. The first lesson is collaboration, and it's not a soft, inspirational kind of collaboration. It's a hard-won collaboration, earned in the face of humiliation, rivalry, and politics. Polio's vaccine story was never tidy. It included genuine triumph and genuine tragedy. It included competition Salk versus Sabin, killed virus versus live virus, played out not only in journals, but in headlines and funding decisions. It included errors like Qatar that forced the world to admit an uncomfortable truth. Even a good idea can become lethal when manufacturing, oversight, and speed collide. And it included something almost unbelievable: Cold War cooperation. An American scientist's work tested at scale by the Soviet system, results feeding back into Western policy. In an era defined by ideological hostility, a virus made enemies behave briefly as colleagues. Polio taught us that microbes ignore flags, and that our defenses have to ignore them too. The second lesson is infrastructure. To the public, the fight against polio often looked like a miracle: a shot, a sugar cube, a vanishing terror. But under that simplicity was machinery networks, labs, supply chains, surveillance systems, trained workers, reporting protocols that had to be built and maintained like a national road system. The Global Eradication Initiative created a kind of health skeleton in places that had never had one. Cold chains reached villages that had never had reliable electricity. Lab networks learned to detect not just illness, but viral identity, what strain, what lineage, what direction it's moving. Emergency operations centers learned how to coordinate field teams, how to respond quickly, how to treat outbreaks like emergencies rather than inevitabilities. And those systems did not vanish when cases declined. They became the backbone that other health efforts leaned on. Vitamin delivery, measles campaigns, outbreak response for entirely different pathogens. Polio's infrastructure became a quiet inheritance. It taught the world that disease control is not just a product you invent, it's a capacity you build. The third lesson is the most uncomfortable one, and perhaps the most relevant to the present: trust. The mid-century era that produced mass vaccination campaigns in the United States depended on a social contract that now feels almost alien. People lined up because they believed. They believed the doctors, the public health announcements, the institutions. Even when the Qatar incident happened, when the system failed in a way that was both shocking and real, the response was not to abandon vaccination forever. It was to demand better oversight, better standards, better regulation. The trust was bruised, but it was repairable. In the last mile of eradication, the world discovered what happens when trust is not repairable by paperwork alone. In places where governments have lied before, where outside powers have harmed before, where people have been used as pawns before, a vaccine campaign can be interpreted through a lens that has nothing to do with biology. A needle can be read as a threat. A health worker can be read as a spy. A rumor can become stronger than a statistic. Polio taught us that the most advanced science is fragile if it cannot be carried into a community with respect and credibility. You cannot cold chain your way through mistrust. You cannot sequence your way out of a conspiracy theory that's been grafted onto genuine historical grievance. In other words, in the endgame, sociology becomes part of immunology. The fourth lesson is perseverance, and it is less romantic than people like to pretend. Perseverance isn't one heroic day in an auditorium with flashbulbs. Perseverance is the next day, and the next, and the next. When the story is no longer exciting, when funding fatigue sets in, when the public assumes the problem is already solved, when the remaining cases are few enough that they feel like distant trivia rather than urgent alarms. Polio eradication has been a multi-generational effort. It has required volunteers who never meet the children they protect. It has required health workers who vaccinate in heat, in rain, under threat. It has required national leaders to keep supporting a goal whose success, paradoxically, makes it less visible each year. The last percent has taken so long because it is not only the hardest terrain, but the hardest psychology. People are eager to fight the monster when it's roaring. They get tired when it's only whispering. And yet, the whisper is precisely when you must be relentless, because a virus only needs a single chain of susceptible hosts to rebuild. There is another legacy too, one that doesn't show up in global policy documents but lives in bodies. Polio survivors carried the disease into the rest of their lives, not only as weakness, but as adaptation. They were forced into creativity. Braces became engineering problems. Staircases became daily negotiations. Fatigue became a budget they managed like money. Many lived with pain that was invisible to co-workers and friends. Many grew older with post-polio syndrome, confronting a second narrowing after decades of hard stability. Their existence is a reminder that preventing polio is not only about preventing death, it's about preventing decades of consequence. It's about preventing the long echo. And now, as we look toward a world where polio could become only the second human disease eradicated after smallpox, we have to hold two truths at the same time. One, the triumph is real. Science did something extraordinary. Ordinary people contributed dimes and patience and consent and volunteer hours and built a shield that spans continents. Two, the victory is unfinished until it's finished everywhere. Until the last reservoir is gone. Until surveillance finds nothing but absence long enough that absence becomes evidence. Until the disease cannot return from a place of conflict or from gaps in coverage. Until the rare complications of a live vaccine no longer have any opportunity to appear because the world has transitioned safely and completely. If polio teaches a final lesson, it may be this. Safety is not a feeling. Safety is maintenance. It is the daily, sometimes boring work of keeping the lights on, the water clean, the vaccines delivered, the rumors answered, the systems funded, the health workers protected. The Forbidden Dispensary doesn't tell these stories to leave you frightened. Fear, by itself, is a cheap substance. It burns fast and leaves nothing useful behind. We tell them because the past is a laboratory too. In it, you can see how progress sometimes creates new vulnerabilities, how errors can reshape policy, how the world's most terrifying threats can be defeated not by a single genius, but by millions of coordinated, ordinary actions. So tonight, as you sit in whatever quiet room you're in, phone glowing, lamp low, a familiar wall at your shoulder, remember what it meant when parents once heard, "I don't feel good" in summer and felt their hearts sink into a place they couldn't reach with their hands. Remember the doors with placards, the smell of disinfectant, the whoosh-clunk of an iron lung, the sugar cube pressed to a child's tongue like a promise. And if you're lucky enough to live in a world where that fear is distant, treat that distance like what it truly is, a gift purchased by people who refuse to accept paralysis as fate. This has been the Forbidden Dispensary. Tonight's drawer is closed. For now, you can rest. You can let the weight of the story settle and simply breathe. Even after you close a drawer, the room remembers what was inside it. That's the strange thing about public health victories. When they work, they erase their own evidence. The wards empty, the machines are rolled into storage, the photographs yellow in boxes, the vocabulary disappears from everyday speech, and a generation is born into a world so protected that the protection looks unnecessary. It's the paradox of prevention. The better it succeeds, the more it invites disbelief. There is a moment quiet, almost invisible, when a society begins to treat its own hard-won defenses as optional. That moment doesn't come with a headline. It comes with a shrug, with a delayed appointment, with a parent saying, "We'll do it later," with a community deciding that because they haven't seen the disease, it must not be real. Polio, more than almost any other illness, punishes that kind of forgetting. Because polio doesn't need a crowd of believers to return. It needs a chain, a small break in routine immunization, a pocket of children missed because a clinic ran out of fuel, because a rumor got traction, because a conflict closed a road, because the health worker who used to knock on doors was threatened into silence. And when that chain forms, the virus doesn't re-enter society with ceremony. It re-enters through the ordinary, through hands, through water, through a child who never looks sick enough to alarm anyone. The world learned this the hard way in the late stages of eradication, when surveillance became less like a simple counting of cases and more like listening for footsteps in an empty house. Because in a near polio-free world, one paralytic case is not just one case. It's an alarm bell that suggests hundreds of silent infections moving beneath the floorboards. That's why modern eradication work can feel obsessive to outsiders. The stool samples, the genetic sequencing, the rapid response campaigns triggered by what looks like a single spark. The endless meetings, the maps, the micro plans broken down to neighborhoods and alleyways. It's because at the end of the war, you are no longer fighting an enemy army. You are hunting for the last ember. And embers do not announce themselves. They sit quietly and wait for dry wood. There is another uncomfortable truth in this stage. The world has changed in ways that make the last mile harder than the first. In the mid-century American story, fear created compliance. Parents lined up because the threat was visible. Children in braces, neighbors quarantined, headlines counting deaths. Even skepticism could be overwhelmed by the sight of an iron lung. But in the last mile, the threat is almost invisible because success has made it so. And in that vacuum, other narratives compete. Narratives built from politics, identity, grievance, social media dynamics. Narratives that can take a rare vaccine complication and inflate it into a universal danger, while ignoring the catastrophe that returns when vaccination collapses. It's not that humans have become more foolish. It's that information has become less local and more weaponized. And health, being deeply personal and deeply political, is an easy target for manipulation. Polio eradication teams have had to become more than medical teams. They've had to become translators of science into trust, of policy into dignity, of a global mission into local benefit. They've learned repeatedly that you cannot win the last mile with vials alone. You need the village elder who will stand at a doorway and say, "Let them in." You need the religious leader willing to speak clearly against fear. You need the mother who is tired of campaigns but still holds out her baby's hand. You need the health worker who walks anyway. And there is a final layer that makes polio uniquely haunting, even among diseases the world has tamed. Its symbol is not fever, not rash, not bleeding. Its symbol is absence. The absence of movement, the silence of a limb, the stillness that looks, to the unprepared eye, like a child simply choosing not to stand. That's why the old photographs remain so powerful. Not because they show death, but because they show life continuing under constraint, life reorganized around what the virus stole. Braces, crutches, wheelchairs, a shoulder permanently higher from years of compensation, a hand that never fully opened again, a breath that required a machine. Those images are not meant to terrify. They are meant to anchor memory, to prove the threat was real when the present tries to forget. And memory matters because eradication, if it happens, will bring a new responsibility. A strange one. If the world truly eliminates wild polio everywhere, it won't mean the story is over in the way people imagine. It will mean the story becomes a matter of custody, of containment, because the virus will still exist in laboratories. It will still exist in frozen samples and research stocks, held for surveillance, for manufacturing, for the scientific reasons that always sound good until you imagine a freezer failing, a protocol breaking, a human error slipping through the cracks. When a disease is eradicated, the world doesn't simply celebrate and move on. It has to decide how to guard the absence. It has to decide what forever costs. This is why the final chapter of the polio story is not just a medical chapter. It's a human one. It's about whether we can sustain a global promise long after the fear that created it has faded. And that, in its own way, loops us back to where we began tonight, the safest place of all, home. Because the threat was never only out there, it was never only in foreign maps and distant outbreaks. Polio was always a reminder that the boundary between the public world and the private world is thin. A child runs outside and comes back inside. Hands touch surfaces and then touch faces. The community's health becomes the family's fate. In that sense, polio didn't just terrorize summers, it rewired how people understood belonging. You don't merely live in a city, you share its water, its air, its habits, its immunities. You share its weaknesses too. So if the world reaches that day, when the last wild virus is gone and the monitoring clock runs out and officials can finally say the words with confidence, there will be celebration. There should be. A second eradication would be one of humanity's rarest accomplishments. But there should also be something quieter, a moment of respect for the generations who lived through the era when every summer felt like a gamble. For the nurses who learned to care for children trapped in steel. For the therapists who fought over methods while children lay in plaster. For the scientists who chased an invisible agent through glass and tissue. For the volunteers who turned dimes into laboratories. For the survivors who carried the echo into old age. And maybe, too, a moment of humility. Because the lesson isn't, we conquered nature. The lesson is, when we choose to act together, we can interrupt a tragedy that otherwise repeats itself forever. That's the real forbidden knowledge here. Not a dark secret, but a hard one. The monster doesn't leave because we stop being afraid. It leaves because we keep doing the work after the fear fades. This has been the Forbidden Dispensary. Now the drawer is truly closed, and if you can, let the room be quiet. Let your breath be ordinary. Let the silence mean what it's supposed to mean.